I'm here today with Ben Shorrock, who's MD of TechSpark. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
So today we were going to talk about entrepreneurship and startups. I just wanted to kind of get a better grip on what you actually do here. So can you tell us a little bit about what the activities within the engine shed here in Bristol?
Absolutely. So Engine Shed is very much built as a hub for all sorts of things that are going on in Bristol and Bath, with startups, with tech companies, brings in the university, brings in the public sector here, and really tries to mix things up and allows companies to talk to each other and sort of get those serendipitous moments to see what happens.
Great. So why do you think Tech Nation, for example, have named the Bristol and Bath tech hub, if you like, as the most productive digital tech cluster of this year?
It's a really interesting question, because I think a lot of it comes down, as with everything, to the talent that's here. There's a really interesting mix of experienced and new talent coming out of the universities here, and all sorts of different industries that come together, from the very creative things like Hardman Animation and the BBC, through to hard engineering with people like Airbus and the Ministry of Defence, and tech sits as a platform across all of that, and that mix of the creative stuff through gaming and through digital content through to some of the more hardware based things with people like Xmos and Huawei really gives us a real differentiator.
So very much looking outwardly in an international sense. So what do you think the Bath and Bristol cluster are doing differently, which is attracting so much interest internationally?
I think it's very much a cliche, but the city and both the cities are really of an ideal size for that type of cluster. So you see it in other places, you see it in the Valley, you see it in Cambridge. Everything here is sort of 1-2 degrees of separation. Everybody knows each other. It's very easy to get about and to find who you need to find, and that's a real difference to some of the bigger global cities where effectively you're anonymous most of the time.
So you're saying that smaller cities often suit these sort of hubs better than, say, a larger city like London or Manchester, for example?
Yeah, I think what we get here is a cluster of businesses. It's still a big cluster. There's still 60,000-70,000 people working across tech here, but what it means is that actually a lot of those people have worked together in previous roles across all sorts of different businesses, and that really allows for a mixing of ideas and a mixing of business opportunities that you don't get in a lot of bigger cities.
So obviously Bath and Bristol is home to Set Squared, which is one of the world's largest incubators, if not the largest. So what are the roles in incubators in supporting up and coming startups, do you think? How do they help startups?
So I think Set Squared's a really interesting model. The things that they're doing here are that they're very central to the entire clustering community. So only a fairly small percentage of the companies they're working with are coming out of the university. Quite often the entrepreneurs they have are older, which means they've had multiple businesses, multiple jobs, and that's a real differentiator against a lot of other incubators which are taking a much younger cohort. The fact that they are organised so that people can be in there for as long as they need to be in there and grow without there being a very specific set of accelerator model of you're in here for 3 months really means that they can give very bespoke support, which is very different to a lot of the other incubator models.
So how are organisations or startups classified to make them meet the criteria as being tech? So what's your criteria for accepting a new startup in this?
So I think across the cluster there's a wide definition of tech here. What you tend to get is companies going everything through big data, Internet of Things, smart cities type work, right through to animation and publishing. And what's interesting here is a lot of those things cross over. So the types of things that are coming out of animation and big data are startups like Yellow Dog, which is a rendering service which uses big data platforms around animation, and you don't get that in a lot of other places because those two sets of organisations and sets of industries don't come across each other that much, so the challenges aren't there as often. So it really springs up all different sets of ideas.
looking at the way the political landscape is changing, shall we say, with the onset of Brexit within the next couple of years, do you think that's going to change the way startups and incubators operate, or do you think it's going to be pretty much business as usual once all the contract work has been sorted out by the politicians country to country?
I think it's interesting because it's a whole new set of challenges, and everything at the moment is still completely up in the air. So it's hard to say one way or the other whether it will be good or bad, but I think what's interesting about that startup market is those companies, by their definition, are small and nimble and are there to take opportunities. So to me, that's only going to be a whole new set of opportunities, and being based somewhere like Bristol and Bath really supports that, because the things that make strong clusters and strong businesses are about having good talent, having good infrastructure, being able to connect into the right types of universities and research programs, and all that's here and isn't going to change because Europe's going to change. So there will be challenges, but I would hope that those businesses would very much rise to that.
What do you think it is that makes a good entrepreneur? I mean, is it a case that people are by nature entrepreneurial, or do you think it depends on how they're brought up and nurtured? I mean, what are your personal thoughts from all the people you've met?
So I think it's a combination of the two. It's surprising how many of our most successful entrepreneurs here have worked for big corporates, worked for startups, and then decided to set something up themselves. And you very much find that they're not people who you would necessarily have said at 20, 21 coming out of university, or maybe not even going to university, I want to set up a business. But as they've grown their experience, they've realised they absolutely can do that, and they're some of the most successful ones we have. So I do think there's a big piece of learning about entrepreneurialism and learning how to run a business before you go off and do that.
And another thing that's coming through now is a thing called entrepreneurship, where large companies encourage some of their staff to act like entrepreneurs. Is that something you're seeing more and more of yourself? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we've got some very, very big corporates here. So we have big presences from people like Oracle and Airbus and BAE Systems, and HP Labs have their largest research department outside the US here. And you do find actually that some of those key people driving things make a real difference. There's a couple of individuals who have really made a difference in the cluster and in their companies by effectively being a good entrepreneur.
So do some of those larger companies also act as kind of mentors to some of the up and coming ones, as advisors, if you like, sort of non-exec directors?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that idea that here a lot of the companies and a lot of the people know each other anyway. What you'll tend to find is there's a cohort of people who all went through the same companies at the same age. So there's a big cohort of people who all worked for Inmos and then ST Microelectronics. Yeah. And a lot of those are senior in big corporates, but a lot of the other ones are setting up their own startups. So they all really work together.
And what do you think are the biggest challenges at the moment for startups? I mean, obviously, I guess the biggest one is money, but I mean, are there a lot of grants now that wannabe tech companies can prevail upon?
So money is always a challenge. From a public sector point of view, we don't have much money here, partly because it's a very prosperous city, so we don't need the money. I think the key thing for a lot of the businesses, and it's a UK thing, is how those businesses can scale and continue to grow. We've got lots and lots of businesses that get to a certain size, can raise money. It's fairly easy to raise money at a seed level now, but the challenge is growing to a scale and a size that allows them to continue to grow and do things globally.
So you say that you're public funding, so do you get your funding from local government or the central government?
So there is some local government money here, and people like Set Squared are supported by both the universities and central government. But there isn't as much as if you go to some of the other parts of the country. What we do find here is it's fairly easy for us to attract private money from London and other places. And a lot of self-made money here that wants to reinvest in the community. Not as much as I'd like, but...
No. So do you think central government is actually doing enough to help and encourage new entrepreneurs coming through?
I think there is a lot of support there. I don't think there's a major challenge in the UK if you want to set up a business compared to some of our competitors, I suppose, internationally. There's always things you could do more. There's lots of things you could do around migration and talent coming in internationally. That some of that's absolutely key that continues to happen. But realistically, there's a lot of support when you compare us to things like the US and Europe. So we're still in a good place.
So I guess that's one of the concerns post-Brexit about the ability for companies who need certain people with certain skill set to come into the country, and not just on short-term visas and stuff. So I guess that's probably one of the concerns you have post-Brexit. What will happen about that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work we do is with Invest Bristol Bath, whose job is to go out and talk about why you would come here internationally. And that's a real concern when we talk to some businesses, especially businesses who had previously thought about setting up European headquarters. I think what we've found so far is that the talent that's already here wants to stay, and there are routes to bringing in more talent. So there are still lots and lots of companies who are looking at investing. We're talking this week, in fact, to a big Japanese investor who's setting up a European headquarters. Strava have recently set up their European headquarters here. Cray, Supercomputing have as well. And all of them are setting up because they can still access talent here that's indigenous, as well as bring in other talent internationally.
Because a lot of the CEOs, CIOs I've interviewed in the past all say that one of their biggest worries at night is trying to find the right talent and filling in the right posts. I mean, do you think that's been getting worse, or is it kind of always a factor?
I don't think it's got worse. I think the types of talent change. So very specific programming skills, things like data scientists are getting harder and harder to get, but that's the nature of industry. As we all go into big data much more, there's a limited number of data scientists out there, and we're not training as many as we'd like. So you will always get that sort of ebb and flow of things. There is a challenge of how you move people from a fairly junior level up within businesses as well, which I think is something we need to do more on.
And of course, in order to fill the vacancies within different skills slots, one thing that we've found at BCS is that there aren't really enough women in the IT sector. I think it's something like 13% of the sector is made up of women. I mean, that seems to be changing now a little bit, but I mean, what's your own perspective from the people you've spoken to and women you've spoken to? Is there something that's putting them off coming into the industry, or do you think that's changing now?
I think it's a challenge. There isn't enough women in the industry, and we'd really like it to be more. I think part of the challenge is you always have, and I find myself in these conversations often, where it's two white men talking about bringing women into the industry. There are some really interesting projects happening here which are starting to do that more and more. We have things like the Festival of Female Entrepreneurship. We have some great coding clubs here actually, which are younger women going out and teaching coding clubs at girls' schools, which is a really interesting way of doing it. And hopefully that will make an impact, but it's a 20-year job. It's not something that's going to resolve itself anytime soon. And
I think this is the same factor with the way the government has now readdressed the way IT, for example, is taught in schools, and that's going to take quite a while to come through, because obviously at one point IT was kind of almost like learning how to use spreadsheets and not a lot else. And now that's changed with things like Raspberry Pi being introduced into schools. Have you seen any kind of change with some of the youngest people moving into this sector? Are they kind of better able to deal with actually working in industry than before, do you think?
So I think there is a cliche in that they're much more digital natives, and that does happen much more. So there's some positive signs coming out of there. I think there's still more work to be done at school level. We work closely with a number of schools and further education colleges, and quite a lot of those schools are tasked to teach IT and the teachers don't necessarily know how to do that. So it's not something that can just be mandated from a central source and will resolve itself quickly. It takes a long time, and it's much more about how you pull in that network together to do that successfully.
And would you have any top tips for would-be entrepreneurs who are maybe just thinking of starting up their first business, or in those tentative steps of making those first inquiries? What would your advice be?
So I think there's key things that you should always do. Cash flow is always the challenge. It's certainly always been the challenge for us. I think you should absolutely look at what support you can access, because there is a lot of support out there from people who are very experienced doing it. And I would say you should really be looking at where you're doing things. So there's some great places across the whole of the UK, but in particular Bristol and Bath, as I would say, where you can set up fantastic tech businesses. And sometimes if you're setting up a business, you need to be looking at where the best place is, not just where you happen to be.
So the United States claims to have 27 million entrepreneurs. I mean, would you say we have, size related, a similar sort of percentage of would-be entrepreneurs in this country? How are we doing for entrepreneurial?
It's probably a little less than 27 million.
Not the numbers, but the ratio of size of companies.
I think it's happening more and more. We've done some stuff recently with the University of Bath and the Entrepreneurial Society, and some of the things that are coming out of that student society are absolutely amazing. I remember when I was at university, it was a very different beast. I wasn't so interested in that type of thing as going out drinking like all the rest of the students, and the focus about what they want to do and how they want to go out and do things is very different now. So I think we're absolutely moving down that track.
And you've kind of mentioned a little bit about yourself. Can you give me a little potted history about your own background and how you come to be here?
Sure. So I've worked across a whole set of different businesses over the last 5 or 6 years, really working with how businesses can invest into the UK, either with people like UKTI, who are government supported, or a couple of different programs to really say, there's some really interesting things happening in the UK, why don't you come here? And one of the areas that I was working with was with TechSpark, whose job is to connect the cluster here and really try and fill in any gaps around things like talent and raising money. And I've moved over into doing those things with TechSpark, and it's fantastic. There's real growth happening here at the moment. It's a really exciting time.
Talking of exciting times, BCS itself has now got an underlying mantra of making IT good for society. What does that initially sort of seed in your brain in relation to startups and the people you're dealing with?
So I think there's all sorts of problems that can be resolved using tech, and the things that were insurmountable not too long ago. So there's some really interesting tech for good startups here, people like Neighbourly, who are growing at a massive rate, and people like Olio, which is a waste food sharing platform, which do things that you wouldn't be able to do. I think what's interesting as well is there's a growing movement here about how you would use tech in a way that's engaging to the general public. So there's a big program called Playable Cities, which is about how you would make smart cities human, because I think people in the industry, we all think it's amazing and all these things are going to happen, but there's real pushback from the general public, and we have to make sure that that usability and that people are confident is working, and by doing that there'll be much more engagement in the long term.
So what are your predictions for the tech sector, particularly within the southwest area?
So I think there's going to be lots more growth. I think we're really at a point now where the cluster's becoming much better known internationally, so there's much more investment coming in internationally. There's some really interesting things happening here in industries that are growing at massive rates. So Bristol and Bath is a European hub for virtual reality. There's some really interesting VR startups and a massive VR World Congress event happening here, and that will drive that industry in the next few years. There's a whole set of skills around big data and the Internet of Things, which effectively are going to be propping up dozens of different industries in the next 20 or 30 years. So it puts us in a really interesting place and a really exciting place.
Of course, IT now is so ubiquitous, it kind of underpins pretty much everything we do in our professional and leisure time. One thing that's obviously considered by BCS is that because the IT industry is such a young industry, it's sort of less than 60 years old really, unlike other industries where like lawyers or medical staff, there's codes of practice which are sort of mandatory and you can be struck off a list for acting improperly, etc. There's nothing like that really that's mandatory within the IT industry. I just wondered whether you thought that it would be a good idea for government to make something like that mandatory, or it should be, you know, continued voluntary code of practice where IT people who work within the IT industry should maybe sign up to a group to have a voluntary code of practice which they adhere to, or do you think it should be more mandatory type thing?
So I think, I'm not sure it should be mandated, but I think there will be much more call for it going forward, and it's interesting times in that people are becoming much more aware of how IT is impacting on their lives and who owns their data and where their data is being stored and things like that. And I think one of the things I found really interesting and was counterintuitive to me was a lot of the young people we work with are much more on the ball about where their data is and who's holding it and how sensitive they are to that.
Okay.
So I think it will be driven from the bottom up with that type of attitude, because they're much less relaxed about who holds their data and what they're doing with it than adults at the moment.
Okay, that's counter to what a few of the security experts at InfoSec said to me. They were saying that they were worried about a lot of the digital natives, you know, sort of being a lot more blasé about where their data is. But it's interesting.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, because I assumed that, and it's because they're aware that it is their data and it has value, which a lot of people aren't aware of now. So they're just much more aware of what's going on and where things are being held.
So would you say the UK entrepreneurial ecosystem is healthy at the moment?
I think so, yeah. I think there's some really interesting companies and startups that are coming out. I think what we always want more of is companies who can grow to be a global giant. I think we're at an interesting time at the moment with people like Arm being acquired by SoftBank, and whether we want that type of foreign investment. But all of that starts with small startups coming, and the more of that we have, the more chance we have of having these global giants in the long term. So it's interesting.
And how do angel investors, for example, figure into startups?
There's lots of things through seed investment and SEIS, and there's lots of that going on here. We've also found that there's lots more alternative finance happening here, so peer-to-peer lending. There's some really interesting things happening through crowdfunding of businesses here, and that allows companies to have that sort of first 6-12 months of development and bringing money to bear to things before they need to start pulling in an income.
I was going to say, how successful is crowdfunding when it comes to tech companies? Because I know you see on the internet all the time people trying to raise money for art projects, for example, like films, etc. But you don't hear quite as much publicly about them crowdfunding for a new tech startup. I mean, is it as successful as you're thinking?
So we may be slightly skewed here because Crowdcube are in the cluster, so obviously it's known what's going on and there's a way to access into Crowdcube. But there's some really interesting projects. We have a project called Crowd10, which is effectively a Crowdcube accelerator, and they've run a couple of tranches now with tech companies that have been really successful. The amount that they've raised has been generally more than they initially asked for, which is fantastic, and there's been a high success rate there. I think a lot of those businesses aren't what in the first instance you would think of as tech. So for example, there's a great business called This Mum Runs, which is a running club and social media platform for mums, because mums can't run at a time when most people go out and run. You wouldn't necessarily immediately think that's a tech business, but then actually if you look at it, it's a social media platform and it's a big data platform.
Yeah.
So it is those types of things where it's not necessarily immediately obvious.
Now, we've talked about incubators this morning, but what about accelerators, as you just mentioned? Are they quite an integral part of the whole startup environment?
So I think they are more in some other parts of the UK than they are here. We have a couple of other incubators and accelerators in Bristol and Bath. I think what we've tended to find, though, is that companies need to grow at their own speed. And some of those companies, like Ultra Haptics, started off as a university idea and then grew and are now growing at a phenomenal rate. Some of them grow more steadily. So accelerators can be fantastic, certainly with smaller sets of startups, but they're not necessarily always the catch-all.
Very few things are, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Finally, I was just wondering which locally seeded industries are you kind of most surprised at how well they've done from the local area?
So I don't know if it's surprised, but there's some companies here who are doing absolutely phenomenally that people wouldn't necessarily know are here. So people like Imdb were acquired by Amazon. Now over 250 million people a month access their website. People like Yogscast, which is a YouTube gaming channel which has 24 million subscribers, came out of two friends at the University of Bristol messing around on YouTube, recording themselves playing games, are now a global company.
Wow.
People like Ultra Haptics, which from a technology point of view is haptic feedback in the air using sound waves, which is amazing, effectively Star Trek type force field technology, all come out of people doing things they're really passionate about here. And it's really important that we shout about the fact that they're here and they're doing things, and it's not all just about London or all just about a couple of other places.
And of course you've got Bristol Robotics Laboratory, haven't you?
We do, yeah. So Bristol Robotics Laboratory is amazing. Some of the things in there are absolutely world-beating. It's one of the largest robotics labs in Europe. Some of the things in there are terrifying as well, but they have some amazing things. So one of the things they're doing is robots that are using power fuel cells using human waste and organic waste. So eventually these robots would effectively be able to feed themselves and power themselves, and then they'd be autonomous, and then it's only a matter of time before we're superfluous.
Oh well. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.